I welcome the panel. We have a very distinguished panel, and I don't think I'm going to introduce them one by one, but you know that most of them also come from movements in the field and are not just seminar room persons, but have spoken out and taken positions on a wide-ranging issues, which makes what they will have to say on the abolition of nuclear weapons even more significant and important. So I'm going to ask Professor Manoranjan Mohanty to open the discussion.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted that this meeting is taking place, and the CNDP India, together with Pakistan India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy, and several other organizations have come together to renew the campaign for abolition of nuclear weapons. The Pak India Forum is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, and during these 20 years, 7 joint conventions have been held, and unfortunately, for the last 5 years, the attempt to hold a joint convention in Pakistan failed, so we had the last convention in Allahabad in December 2011. But the National Convention for India was held 2 months ago here in Delhi, in Rajghat. And one of the 5 principles which every member signs to work for, affirm and work for, is disarmament and denuclearization of the subcontinent. And so abolition of nuclear weapons and disarmament are one of the fundamental principles for which the Pakistan India People's Forum has been working all these 20 years. And we had opposed the nuclear tests in 1998. There were simultaneous protests by the forum members in both Indian cities and Pakistan cities, and several of our Japanese friends had joined, CNDP India friends had joined, we had joined them, and they had joined Delhi University protests and so on. Now this particular moment is significant for 2 reasons. Because several non-nuclear nations have now become active, and for example, on the 21st October, when some 116 or more countries in the UN came out with a proposal for a ban treaty, India was nowhere. So this momentum has picked up because we thought that after the, first of all, and these debates have taken place in CNDP forums and elsewhere, that the Cold War had no justification for nuclear weapons, and then there was the hope that the post-Cold War will see more movement towards abolition of nuclear weapons. We have not seen that. In fact, there has been more nuclearization. And therefore, the time has come to take stock of the post-Cold War situation, where US is determining the security scenario in all parts of the world in the name of fighting terrorism, and has actually escalating the process of militarization. That's one. The other more immediate and very serious danger is the trend of militarization of our society, state, and by our I mean the entire South Asian society. The militarization process is seen in terms of increased defense expenditures, and CNDP has documented beautifully all the data. This piece now, the latest special issue, has so many articles with that. So the defense expenditure has gone up, and the highlight that they point out is this year India became the largest arms importer in the world. Anyway, so the militarization is seen not only in terms of defense expenditure, but also in repressive laws. Iram Sarmila has now entered the 13th year of her fast against the 14th year? Yes. 13 completed? Okay, 14th year, day before yesterday, and against the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And we had a national campaign. Several of us were present in Mumbai, Bangalore, here. There were 5 major meetings during the last 4 months. But it is not even an issue in the elections. I mean, the elections are, they have been hijacked by, the 2 dominant parties in directions which have nothing to do with people's issues. So here is a militarization process which is being challenged by people on the ground. You cannot have peace in the Northeast and Kashmir unless you scrap this law. Same with the Disturbed Areas Act. Same with the deployment of paramilitary forces, army and armed police all over central India, Northeast, Jammu and Kashmir, and in many parts of India. So the militarization process is part of this nuclear scenario. And we have to keep that in mind. And the India, Pakistan, China, and far away there, Israel, and Saudi Arabia says anytime they can go for nuclear weapons. They have funded Pakistan nuclear program and so on. Now, Asian military environment has been now escalated in terms of tensions because of the kind of military strategy which has operated, and the elites of India and Pakistan, together with the American leadership, have become party to this militarization process and nuclearization process, and therefore it's very important that we escalate our campaign, the peace campaign, against militarization and against nuclear weapons. 3 days ago, the Prime Minister, addressing the diplomats, talked about what I have called Panchanama. Sorry, it's not Panchashil. In fact, Indian Express's article and editorial, Sanjay Baru's article and the editorial, celebrated the fact that it is a complete break with the Nehru tradition. Therefore, to call it Panchashil, as one of the, I think, Times of India, the new Panchashil of Prime Minister, it is just the opposite of Panchashil in 3 ways. One, it had nothing by way of talking about creating an equitable world order, whereas equality and mutual benefit was one of the basic principles of Panchashil, and of course defending sovereignty, territorial integrity, peaceful coexistence, and so on. India is no longer committed to transforming the unequal, unjust world order into just equitable world order. On the other hand, the first principle is how to orient the existing international environment to our advantage of the neoliberal economic strategy. Second, look, number 4 is neighborhood policy. I mean, South Asia policy, or he uses the term subcontinent. The neighborhood policy is now number 4. And third, look at the last Nama. Making external environment serve our domestic values. And what are those values? Pluralism, secularism, and liberalism. What about the Constitution preamble and its values? Equality, justice, freedom, and those values. Therefore, I am extremely disappointed that the Prime Minister has presented a framework which breaks completely with the values of the freedom struggle, values of the early aspirations of the emerging countries which were codified in the non-aligned movement, values which, you remember, even Rajaji led a disarmament initiative. You know, all the leaders, Congress to Swatantra, led in the Gandhi inspiration. In other words, India had a commitment, and Rajiv Gandhi's statement had referred to that in 1988. So the commitment to disarmament as a value, as a perspective, I think no longer appears in our framework. Let me conclude reiterating the forum's perspective on peace and democracy, which is the consensus left democratic peace-loving perspective of people of South Asia. That peace is the condition for justice, and when you address the burning political issues that divide people, that create exploitative relationship, that oppresses people, when you address conditions of justice, you try to work for peace, and peace is the value. Second, by democracy we mean people's rights, people's democratic rights, and therefore the unjust repressive laws must be scrapped, and there must be participatory democracy at every level. And democratic rights are both civil liberties and socio-economic and cultural rights of people, and therefore autonomy, self-determination, and decentralization of power are basic to democratic rights. Finally, development that is being conceptualized subtly includes peace, equity, and sustainability. And therefore, the neoliberal strategy, which is part of this broad paradigm of militarization, using coercion of the state forces to impose neoliberal economic strategy, like the big steel mines, steel projects, and so on, in central India, Odisha, and so on. That kind of development has to be opposed. So this paradigm of militarization, which has promoted nuclear trade and US hegemony, has to be challenged by a challenge to the development paradigm which is unfolding in the country, and we must demand that nuclear weapons must be abolished completely. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Aruna Roy.
Thank you very much. I'm really going to look at this entire issue from a common person's perspective. And because I work with very poor people, I feel that this issue has somehow left them untouched. In a sense, it's completely and absolutely related to everything that they want and everything that they don't want. But there is no real understanding of what nuclearization will do to them. For them, it is almost a non-issue. And after Kudankulam, and I think Kudankulam has done a great service to this country because of the nature of the campaign, because of the participation of people in that campaign, and because of the issues that they raised, and because of common people coming and speaking, Xavier Amma coming and making her statements in that public hearing we had in Gandhi Peace, and of ordinary people speaking so intelligently about what it would do to them, has, I think, raised the level of consciousness. But even today, if you look at why there is no popular protest against nuclearization, I think it's because the people who can and do protest do not understand the entire ramification of what it will do to their lives. And with you all, I feel somewhat helpless, because we are always dealing with crises, and the crises in my life always is hunger, poverty, unemployment, and therefore to talk about nuclearization and its fallout and what it will do to them seems somewhat remote, but it isn't. So I think we'll have to refashion the discourse in such a way that we break everything down into its components and see how nuclearization is really going to impact all of us in a very, very dramatic and very, very harmful way. Actually, a friend of mine in Kerala had shown me a map, and I don't know how authentic it is, that if you look at the places where the government now wants to set up its atomic plants, there is no space left in India which will be out of the purview of radiation. Now, this really shocked me. This visual pockmarked India, where there would be so many atomic installations, ostensibly for creating energy and power, but in fact with maybe a hidden agenda, but in real effect, there's no difference, because if you have an atomic plant, the fallout is going to affect people around them. So whether it's Rawat Bhata, where people have had cases, but it's really remained isolated in Rajasthan, not really spread into a larger public debate, I think the attempt should be how we can make it part of a natural big public debate where people come together and talk about it, much as we would do about employment or poverty or health or any other issue. And the challenge is with many of us. It lies with us, it lies with the political parties which are committed to it, it lies with social activists who feel that it's part of the entire debate. One of the things I'd like to point out here is that the language and the idiom of this conversation will then therefore have to change. And in the changing of that idiom, the thing that makes people move really is from when you see your personal battle very much part of a larger social battle, or the social battle impacting your personal life. And I think that connect is somewhat missing, and we'll have to make that connect through examples, through logic, through rational arguments, and also through stories. And when that connect is made, and when this pockmarked India is visible to everybody, and some of you must tell me whether that map is really true. I believe it is. But if there is an intention of starting locating so many of these for so-called production of electricity and energy, what it will do to India, and none of us can then say that, oh, it's consumption versus, security of your life, because it's a debate that has to be put on its head. There is a strange thing happening in many parts of the hinterland of India. We now have in many places, including Rajasthan, where I live a fair amount of the time, we have helicopters now which come and which have got small helipads in rural areas, and they go off exploring. Nobody knows why they come. They come and they explore, and we don't know what they're looking for. Whether they're looking for just mineral wealth or they're looking for some kind of something else, nobody knows. And you can't really find out by asking even your collector. Maybe a formal right to information application may deliver some results, it might give us some information, but there is no clarity. So I think a whole set of new questions will have to be raised to find out exactly where we are going, so that this battle can get localized. And unless it gets localized, it cannot get the kind of universal pitch that we need in this country to fight it, because I think it can't remain just within the area of people who read and therefore understand its impact. The other issue I feel which does need to link up, and of which I think many of us are a part, and it's become a huge popular debate, is the whole issue of violence. Violence today, especially against women, has become a kind of issue you don't have to explain anymore. So whether you go to a small village or whether you go to a big town or whether you go to a metropolis, suddenly India has gone into a huge scale understanding of violence against women, whether it's the Khap Panchayats where it's a killing because you marry outside your community, or whether it is violence against women because they do not conform, or whether it is rape, or the varieties in which women are oppressed and violence is used against women, and of course the high profile killings that take place which get reported in the papers. But for me, as a woman and as an activist, there is a link between the violence unleashed on us and the concept of a violent universe. And I think that link also needs to be clearly spelt out. I think in all our women's meetings now we're beginning to talk not only about violence and how the police doesn't function, but how patriarchy and violence goes far beyond. and the concept of a violent world, or a world in which there will be nation states which will use violence to do what? To specify what? To protect what? To protect what? To protect what kind of security does it spell us? What is the meaning of security? And what is the meaning of protection? So is it not an important part of our general discourse and debate that we get involved in issues which are not necessarily only topically relevant to us within our own environment, but which in fact promotes the kind of violence in one way, making the whole society aggressive, macho, and extremely patriarchal. So I think that debate also has to come somewhere into the main debate now, and our discourse should slightly change. I'm saying all this because I feel that many of the reasons why we feel a sense of stagnation in many of our discourses and debates, I feel is because we are unable to communicate. And the inability to communicate is something which we'll have to turn into ourselves and be introspective about them. See why we have failed to communicate. Many of the normal areas through which we communicate are now denied us, and I don't have to go into it in detail. We know that people like us don't have space in papers, we don't have space in normal television channels, we don't have space in the media that is normally seen as mainstream. But somehow then we have to break out of this and get communication systems working which will communicate these ideas to people. And what are they is a big challenge to us. One is the internet, and I think there should be a huge portal which is a people's portal, not an intellectual's portal where you have lots of words which describe lots of things, but where there are visuals, where you can see not only the impact of nuclearization on people, but where you can see country-wise what the plans are and what the impacted area will be, so that it makes a difference to all of us. In the case of the information campaign, since I come from the Right to Information campaign, I feel that it hasn't been used enough by people in the anti-nuclear campaign. I don't think enough applications have been filed, like for instance, though there is much debate and Prakash may disagree with me on that, but the fact that one Subhash Agrawal filed an application for information and said that political parties must come under the Right to Information Act has created so many ripples. Whether we agree, disagree, whatever position we take. But there hasn't been a similar kind of use of the right to information to get nuclear information out, which might put people in, make people's consciousness rise. And I think it should be, if it can't be one bit of information, it should be a campaign in which we file for information all over the country at the same time, in different parts of the country, and ask for similar information. So pooling the information, you get a huge picture. And in the act of filing that application, many people get involved. So you can get people involved in the understanding of it and in getting ready to fight such a thing by filing right to information applications. And I think it is one way of getting people's consciousness. The other thing that I feel which has been very harmful is that many legislations have been outside the purview of the right to information for the last, been put outside the purview of the right to information the last 3 or 4 years. Many controversial bills that have been sent to Parliament have been put outside the purview of the right to information, and therefore to begin with, in the beginning itself, they are secure from scrutiny, they are secure from questioning. And I think campaigns must make a big noise about it, because it's one way in which we can have access to information which we can use in the public domain to build up public opinion. I'm going to stop here because I don't have very much to contribute in terms of very specialized knowledge, but I do have a position which increasingly I feel that all our campaigns have become more and more insular, and despite the NAPM, the National Alliance of People's Movements, wanting to get people on board, when we even go to Jantar Mantar to protest, we see campaigns in adjoining pandals, like you and we were last time, and Bhargavi, you and I, and we don't even come too much to each other's pandals. Now, if we don't enter each other's pandals to even shout the slogans with each other, we did, but I'm just saying. we don't shout those slogans to each other, with each other, then unless we have a platform in which we are all seen together, we are not going to impact public opinion. And I think it's a challenge to all of us as to how we'll do it, so that we see the interlinkages between someone asking for food, someone asking for information, someone protesting against nuclearization, someone asking for women's rights, someone asking for pensions, whatever it is, that we are all asking for a more peaceful world where money is not spent on defense, but money is spent on education, health, and many other important priorities, where violence is understood in not only its narrow definition, but its wider definition. And I think India is going through a very critical phase, because as the political winds forecast for this country today, there may be an India which will be belligerent, which will go the nuclear way, which has already begun to state extremely machoistic and very aggressive positions, and where our voices will be will depend on how much we are seen together somewhere at some point of time in the immediate future. Because if we don't come and stand together with the political parties that support us and say this is a broad alliance of people who protest against something, I don't see a future where our voices will be heard, because we now are being reduced to a minority when we actually are not, because media's doors are getting closed to our participation and our voices. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jean Rez.
Friends, it has been said that history repeats itself first as a tragedy and then as a farce. But when it comes to nuclear weapons, I fear that history may repeat itself first as a tragedy and then as a catastrophe. Like other weapons, nuclear weapons have been used as soon as they were invented. And the history of world conflicts and world politics since Hiroshima gives no confidence that it will not happen again. On the contrary, the likelihood seems to me that they will be used again, and possibly with far more devastating consequences. The need to avert this catastrophe seems to me to be part of a larger need for moral progress to catch up with technological and scientific progress. During the last few decades, there have been tremendous technological and scientific advances which have contributed to what the economist Angus Deaton called the Great Escape, which an interesting term he used to refer to the tremendous reduction of poverty and deprivation around the world that has taken place in the last 100 years. But it has also generated new dangers and threats to human survival, nuclear weapons and indeed other weapons as well. One example, there are others, whether it's climate change, global warming, misuse of genetic engineering, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that unless our moral standards and social norms evolve and enable us to handle these new powers and technologies, our days are numbered. This contrast between scientific advance and moral progress was well captured by Tagore in an interesting metaphor. I'll read a few lines from what he said, because these metaphors can help us to remember the point. He said, sorry, I have to find it. He said that man, with his mental and material power far outgrowing his moral strength, is like an exaggerated giraffe whose head has suddenly shot up miles away from the rest of him, making normal communication difficult to establish. This greedy head, with its huge dental organization, has been munching all the topmost foliage of the world, but the nourishment is too late in reaching his digestive organs, and his heart is suffering from want of blood. Of this present disharmony in man's nature, the West seems to have been blissfully unconscious. He was talking about the West, but we could talk about the world as a whole, I think, today in the same terms. By the way, the other day I heard about an interesting theory, I don't know if it's true, that one reason why we are not able to find intelligent life in the universe, at least so far, is that the window of time between the development of intelligence and self-destruction is very short. I don't know if it's true. It sounds very speculative to me, but still, I think it's an interesting idea, and it really makes you sit and wonder whether we have reached that stage where self-destruction is just around the corner. Now, since nuclear weapons are in fact often claimed to be a guarantee of peace and to help to prevent war, I'd like to examine that claim a little bit. Achin sometimes feels I get too lost in strategic issues, and that ultimately is really an ethical issue, and I basically agree with that, and since he's the last speaker, I'm sure he will say more about the ethical aspects. But I think it's also important to fight the strategic arguments on their own ground, because I think that is really where the proponents of nuclear weapons are at their weakest. I mean, that's really where it's like shot through with contradictions. As Manish Shankarya pointed out earlier today, many other weapons earlier have been claimed to be the ultimate weapon, starting with bows and arrows. In 1899, somebody called Ivan Bloch wrote an interesting book called The Future of War, where he claimed that war had become impossible and they would never happen again. The reason being that armaments had been developed to such a terrifying level of efficiency that it would now be just madness to go to war. And what he meant by the terrifying efficiency of modern weapon was that what he called the new rifles as opposed to the old rifles. The new rifles could shoot straight. I mean, they were powerful enough to send the bullet in a straight line, as opposed to the old rifles, which had a kind of curvilinear trajectory, so that in order to kill somebody... Parabolic, I'm sorry, that's correct. So that in order to kill somebody, not only you had to aim in the right direction, but you had to also have the right angle, which wasn't so easy. But now that you could shoot straight, you know, nobody could possibly come near you, and nobody would want to do that if they know that you can actually shoot a bullet straight. So therefore he said, no, now we can rest in peace, there will never be any war again. Of course, things turned out otherwise, and within 15 years of the publication of his book, the First World War broke out and killed an estimated 17 million people. The barbarity increased manifold in the Second World War with entirely new techniques of mass destruction, such as wholesale bombing of cities, and culminating, of course, in the use of nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The massacre continued after that with about 250 wars being fought in the 20th century, causing more than 100 million deaths. 100 million, that's not a small number. The savagery of the conflicts also kept increasing. The share of civilian casualties in total casualties, for instance, rose from relatively small at the beginning of the 20th century, something like 10 to 20% of casualties at that time were civilian casualties, that became closer to 90% around the end of the 20th century. As far as nuclear weapons are concerned, as I said, they were used as soon as they were invented, and in fact, initially, there was no fundamental difference between nuclear weapons and other weapons. Nuclear weapons were basically doing more efficiently what conventional weapons were already doing, like the firebombing of Japanese cities, which was done using conventional weapons and had more or less the same kind of effect as a nuclear bomb. There was no moral issue involved, since enemy lives didn't matter. In fact, apparently President Truman had given orders that all the nuclear weapons available should be used until Japan surrendered. So had Japan not surrendered so quickly, it would have continued. The bombs would have gone straight from the assembly line to the battlefield. Of course, there were some technical issues. For example, apparently one military commander complained that the nuclear bombs in Japan were wasted on irrelevant civilians when they would have been better used on military targets. After the end of the Second World War, the outlook remained much the same as long as the US had the monopoly of nuclear bombs. In fact, they made it very clear. One national security document in 1953 said, in the event of hostilities, the United States will consider nuclear weapons to be available for use as other munitions. There was no difference because they had the monopoly, so it was just another weapon. Now this changed, of course, radically when other countries also developed nuclear weapons, so that the United States didn't have the monopoly anymore. And that posed a very difficult question. How do you use nuclear weapons, or the threat of use of nuclear weapons, to achieve political objectives, when you know that if you actually carry out that threat, it will be a kind of suicide, and therefore the threat doesn't have much credibility, because why would anyone believe your threat if carrying it out would be a kind of suicide? This is what is called the credibility issue in the nuclear strategy literature, which has been discussed in thousands of books ever since and never quite resolved. Even today, if you notice in the Indian nuclear policy documents, there's a constant claim that we have a credible, so-called credible nuclear deterrent, but actually it's not clear at all what it means, because there is no simple answer to that dilemma. Some people, of course, have tried to give answers. One of the early contributions on this was a very influential book, which is still being read today as a kind of Bible of strategic thinking, called The Strategy of Conflict by Thomas Schelling, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. And he argued in that book that actually there are ways of doing it. By the way, when I mentioned using nuclear weapons or the threat of nuclear weapons to achieve political objectives, that is basically what deterrence means in the professional literature. It's not self-defense. Self-defense is what deterrence means, or is claimed to mean for the public. But in the strategic literature, deterrence means using nuclear weapons to achieve certain political objectives. For example, at that time, using them to prevent Soviet Union from taking over Berlin. That was the kind of preoccupation that were there at that time. So in that book, he argued that there are actually ways you can use nuclear weapons. For example, he said if the Soviet Union invades Berlin, then of course we don't want an all-out nuclear war. But what we could do is use a relatively small bomb, not on Moscow, but on a small city like maybe Tashkent or something, somewhere around, out of there, and that would basically challenge the Soviet Union to retaliate and put them in that same dilemma. And that was the kind of so-called solution that were found to that credibility column. And of course, if you care sufficiently for Berlin, you might do that, but it's pretty dangerous. And the danger of doing that sort of thing was very well illustrated a few years later during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the more documentation comes out, even until today, about that crisis, the more we realize how close the world came at that time to all-out nuclear conflict. It was literally a miracle that it didn't happen. In fact, Robert McNamara, who was well placed to know what's happened at the time, said that the world came within a hairbreadth of nuclear war, and General George Lee Butler, who was who was at that time commander of the chief of U.S. Strategic Air Command, summed up the situation by saying that the world survived the Cuban Missile Crisis not thanks to deterrence, but only by the grace of God. Kennedy himself at that time said that, in his estimation, the odds of nuclear war in the peak of the Cuban crisis were somewhere between 1 out of 3 and even. And that's the kind of situation we were in at that time, and actually in the light of what we know today, so it was actually probably much worse than that. Now, interestingly, instead of waking up to the dangers and irresponsibility of nuclear deterrence, many strategists at that time interpreted the Cuban Missile Crisis as a vindication of Thomas Schelling's theories that you can actually use the threat of nuclear weapons to achieve political objectives, because they did achieve their objective by threatening the use of nuclear weapons. The dangers of these kinds of situations are very clear from a whole lot of work in game theory. I don't have time to explain that in detail, but even in the very simplest games that capture this kind of situation, you quickly get into a situation where rational analysis of the game just does not tell you what to do. It's not rational analysis anymore. It's psychology, it's a war of nerve, it's brinkmanship. I mean, it's got very little to do with rational analysis. I'll just give you very quickly a simple example. There's something called the chicken game, which has been discussed a lot and actually applies to many of these conflict situations. It's called chicken game because there was a time in the US where youngsters used to play this game. They would drive a car, so there were 2 players, one sitting each in a car and driving to each other at full speed, and then the first one who blinks and gets off the road to let the other one
is the loser.
Is the loser. So it's basically a kind of war of nerve, and a game theorist cannot tell you what to do in that situation. I mean, it's really, there's no rational solution. All they can tell you is, don't play that game. It's really dangerous. Now, the moment you go into more realistic situations, this is a very simple situation, but if you go towards more realistic situations which correspond more closely to what happens in a nuclear conflict or a war, then it gets infinitely more complicated. For example, there's a whole series of things called escalation games, where it's even worse. this was brought out in an experiment by Martin Shubik many years ago. When it's called the dollar auction game. So what he does is he gives a dollar for auction, and the players have to bid for the dollar in steps. Let's say in increments of, let's say, 10 cents. So you can bid, let's say, 20 cents. Then the opponent can either bid further to 30 cents or give up. And then the next one has, suppose that you increase the bid to 30 cents, then again the first player will have to either increase to 40 cents or give up. So you go on bidding like that, and the first person who stops bidding loses the game and loses what they have bid. And what happens when you do that is that many people continue bidding way beyond $1, because once you are in that escalation process, at each step it seems like it's worth bidding 10 cents more so that you don't lose what you have already invested. And so some people go on bidding $10, $15, $20 just to get $1. And that's exactly the structure of many real-world escalation games. Every day in the newspapers there are stories, let us say, of two people going to a hand pump, fighting over who will fill their bucket first. First they have an argument, then one of them slaps the other one goes home and gets his brother, the brother comes back and gives you a lathi, and then by the end of the day some people are dead. I mean, there are all kinds of stories like that all the time. In fact, I sometimes collect them. And beyond these little anecdotes, there are other things that are much more serious, that are escalation games. The recent violence in Muzaffarpur was a little bit like an escalation game. The First World War was the biggest escalation game ever. I mean, it's a case where nobody knows to this day exactly how it got out of hand. It started with an assassination, and then somehow armies mobilized, went at each other, and then they kept fighting for 4 or 5 years without knowing what they were fighting for. According to Eric Hobsbawm, more than 5,000 books have been written about the causes of World War I, and to this day we don't really know how it happened. Last point is that even aside from the fact that there is no rational way of conducting this kind of game, once you have fallen into the trap of playing them, on top of that we have to reckon with the fact that there are also all kinds of irrationalities in human behavior, including the behavior of people who take these kind of decisions. And I'll end with a quote, another quote. This is from Robert Oman, who was also a distinguished game theorist, who won the Nobel Prize, in fact, as it happens, with Thomas Schellings a few days ago, who is very committed to strategic analysis and game theory, but very conscious of the fact that it's all based on a certain assumption about human rationality that doesn't apply in the real world. It's basically a kind of tool of analysis. This is how people would behave if they were rational, but in practice we know that they are not. And so he said, Homo rationalis is a mythical species like the unicorn and the mermaid. His real-life cousin, Homo sapiens, is often guided by subconscious psychological drives or even by conscious ones that are totally irrational. Herd instincts play a large role in his behavior, even when his goals are well defined, which isn't often. His motivation to achieve them may be less than complete. Far from possessing infinite calculating ability, he is often downright stupid. Even when intelligent, he may be tired or hungry or distracted or cross or drunk or stoned, unable to think under pressure, able to think only under pressure, or guided more by his emotions than his brains. And this is only a very partial list of departures from the rational paradigm. So the bottom line is that the claim that there is a rational way of conducting a nuclear conflict is as extravagant as the claim made more than 100 years ago that war had become impossible because rifles could follow a straight trajectory instead of a parabolic trajectory. So I think it's very important not to be fooled by claims that there's such a thing as a quote-unquote responsible nuclear power, that nuclear weapons can be used in a safe manner, that it's a matter of calculated risks and so on. This is simply not true, and that's very clear from the entire literature on this subject. I think I'll stop here, but with perhaps one last word about CNDP. I'm very glad that this event takes place. I feel a bit sorry that I feel like I'm talking to the converted, and I really feel we have to also spend a lot more time and energy going after the general public, as Aruna also has argued, and particularly after the youth and indeed anyone we can reach, because I think we are all convinced, but the issue depends on many other people as well. Thank you.
The abolition of nuclear weapons in this meeting in front of such an audience. John Drez has touched upon many of the issues concerning that. But we have to look at where we stand now in the movement for nuclear disarmament internationally. And then I would like to briefly come to the situation in South Asia, and finally our own domestic situation. Internationally, we have to recognize that the most powerful country in the world, the most militarily powerful country in the world also, the United States of America, maintains a doctrine where it believes in counterforce. That is why it has withdrawn from the ABM treaty earlier. It has built up missile shields in parts of Europe, and the United States says it will not threaten to use nuclear weapons against NPT, non-nuclear weapon states, but those that are in compliance with the nuclear non-proliferation obligations. And of course, it's for the United States to interpret which are the countries which are complying with the nuclear non-proliferation obligations. And the United States, as is well known, retains its first use option, the first use option of nuclear weapons. And after the end of the Cold War, and after the agreement with Russia to reduce some of the nuclear warheads, etc., the United States and the NATO allies have modernized or are modernizing their nuclear weapon forces. So the United States has no intention whatsoever of nuclear disarmament. And last year, when the NATO summit took place in Chicago in May, it affirmed the importance of nuclear weapons. To sum up, the grand design of the United States is to have a position of nuclear primacy now. That is the only power that can win a nuclear war and win without much damage. That is its aim. So even after Obama has come, you all know about Obama's famous speech on nuclear disarmament, but the nuclear weapons employment policy submitted by the Obama administration in June this year, 2013, makes it clear that the principle of counterforce is retained as the central principle in employing nuclear weapons, as also the ability to launch under attack. Each of them are a continuance of the Cold War policies and means that the key elements of nuclear war still remains intact. Counterforce means that weapons are kept at high levels of alert, ready to launch upon warning of an enemy attack, ready to launch upon warning of and able to preemptively attack enemy forces. Both elements, preemptive nuclear strikes and hair trigger alert of nuclear forces. All this means that the threat of nuclear war remains. With the added policy of the anti-ballistic missile shields, the temptation for the US to target other nuclear weapon states or states such as Iran actually exists or increases today. So keeping this in mind, and of course the response of the other nuclear weapon states like Russia and China, we are up against a very difficult task of mobilizing international opinion and world opinion towards moving to at least go towards step by step towards the goal of complete abolition of nuclear weapons. And whether it's through the Conference of Disarmament or, as Professor Mohanty mentioned, the recent October statement given by the UN General Assembly, there are countries and groupings of countries today and forces which are trying to move the path towards going towards discussions and taking certain steps to de-escalate the situation today. And we have to continue to strive to see that, one, an understanding or an undertaking is given by nuclear weapon states not to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states, the de-alerting of deployed nuclear weapons by the nuclear weapon states, an undertaking by all nuclear weapon states not to be the first to use weapons against each other, and ultimately going towards the conclusion of an international convention for prevention of or abolition of nuclear weapons, just as the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention. This is, I think, broadly accepted and understood by all the forces and countries and sections of people who strive or aim for complete nuclear disarmament. But in our country and in South Asia, when we look at this from the perspective of what's happening in our region, here we have a very, what I might say, we have the terrible twins, the terrible nuclear twins, India and Pakistan. And after 1998, I think all of us here had protested against the Pokhran 2 tests and the nuclear weaponization path that India adopted. We are at a point where India and Pakistan are, as we apprehended, inexorably going towards a nuclear arms race within the general framework of an overall arms race. Professor Mohanty talked about the militarization in India. I'll come to that later. But where are we now? In India, we are, I'm not an expert in all the nuclear armaments business, but we are aiming to become a nuclear triad power. We have strategic bombers, we have intercontinental missiles, and we have nuclear submarine based missiles. Pakistan has gone towards tactical nuclear weapons. Now, obviously, what I said about the international situation, some of the things that should be done, that India and Pakistan should declare no first use, should seek for a cap or a moratorium on nuclear weapons production or stockpiles, targeting, non-deployment, all this is something which we would like to have, we would like to work for. But politically, and I am speaking more from the point of view, others have given very valuable perspective from other areas of work. What are we faced with today? Relations between India and Pakistan are going downhill now. It's going to be a big struggle to ensure that the dialogue between India and Pakistan continues. After any incident that takes place, either on the line of control or on the border or any other terrorist incident in India, as you know, the demand is immediately made that you stop talking to Pakistan, and the present Indian government is seen to be a weak government which is not able to take a firm stand against Pakistan. Now, my party is one of the very few means I don't think any other except for the left parties have come out publicly and stated time and again that don't stop the dialogue, continue the dialogue. And now, after the recent developments in Jammu and Kashmir, I'm not going into analyzing what's happening on the LOC. It's a very serious matter according to me. And the number of incidents on the line of control and the latest reports we have, not from the government but from our own small party that we have in Kashmir, the infiltration has increased this year. We are heading towards a very rocky period in India-Pakistan relations. So our first concern or first task is to see that the India-Pakistan dialogue and the prospects of talks do not get derailed. This is going to be a very major or important task for us. Have to go towards taking up some of these questions about the nuclear divide or confrontation between India and Pakistan. So this is something which should be our aim to reach at, but at the present moment, the political situation in India, I'm afraid, is going in the reverse direction. I can't say what happens in the Lok Sabha elections, but all the indications are that we are going to have what happened in 1998 was under a BJP-led government. In fact, that was the first step that they took, Pokhran. And if there is a change in government in India, with the BJP coming back to power, then you will see a dramatic escalation in hostilities with Pakistan. And domestically at present, it is not that as if the BJP comes alone that there is going to be this increase in hostilities. Already under the UPA government, we are seeing a steady increase and accretion of our military budget and procurement of arms. And that is why this struggle for nuclear disarmament, universal and in the context of South Asia, is very much connected with our policies here in India, the foreign policy of India. Our Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh went to Washington on his last official visit, and the only substantial agreement this time was on defense production. And we have been given the status of a closest partner of the United States for military supplies and defense production. The recent debate in the government for increasing FDI in defense production did not lead to an increase. 26% is already there in foreign direct investment in defense production. Important sections of the government wanted it to be made 49%, thanks to the Defense Minister of India, who did not agree. It was not done. But then there was a compromise. They said 26% will remain, but case by case we can decide on having a higher foreign investment. Just like with Russia, we had the BrahMos agreement when Russia got a bigger share. So what I'm trying to drive at is that India, the Indian ruling classes with their dreams of superpower status, of course the bomb was also part of that, the superpower status, irrespective of whether it's the Congress or the BJP who's going to be in power, there is going to be a steady and continuous increase in defense budgets and acquisition of arms. And this brings us to where we are today, that you have now, India has done a complete turnaround as far as its traditional stand on nuclear disarmament and abolition of nuclear weapons. I don't know what my friend Mani Shankar Iyer told you this morning. I know he would have talked about the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan 1988. Yes, it was a very significant step taken by India. But where are we today? We are trying to get into military agreements and arrangements, one with Israel. America's hypocrisy as far as Iran is concerned on the nuclear issue. As you all know, Israel has nuclear weapons, bombs, much before us, and the Americans and Israel are dead against the earlier proposals for a nuclear weapons free zone in West Asia. And we are going to collaborate more in defense, military, security, etc. with Israel. And they have to maintain the fig leaf of, whether we talk about Mahatma Gandhi or Nehru, about nuclear disarmament, abolition of nuclear weapons. But I'm afraid today our domestic political situation is such that we have not been able to mount sufficient opposition or pressure on the Indian government not to embark on this path. This is a reality. Here I must confess that, at least as far as my party and the left who are in parliament are concerned, we have failed to take up this whole issue of defense budgets and defense expenditure. It's a sacred cow in India. You can't talk about defense expenditure in defense budgets. Time and again in the Standing Committee of Parliament on Defense, I have been trying to get our representative at least to raise questions or to put in a dissenting note, but we have not been able to do it. It's become such a strong all-party consensus that we can't let our Jawans down, we can't let our army down, we can't let our country down, but it's something where no questions are asked on defense. If that is the situation, then you can imagine what it is as far as our nuclear weapons are concerned. So that is why it's very necessary to be able to mount this movement or opposition to the whole trajectory that India is taking. In that, I agree with what Arunaji has said and others have said. We have to link it up to the issues which are relevant and vital to the people. We have not been able to do it. Issues of national security, defense are totally isolated from the people and their lives and their experience. We have to be able to work out a platform in which we can link up this struggle against nuclear weapons, against the increasing militarization and the problems of the daily lives of the people, particularly the working people, the poor people. It's an uphill task because somebody mentioned about the Congress and the BJP, but I can tell you, for example, on the question of Pakistan, we cannot get a single party, except one or two very small parties, maybe like Ramvilas Paswan or somebody. None of the regional parties are willing to come and say, no, today we must talk to Pakistan, or let us continue talks with China. No other, very few parties are willing to come on board. And therefore, our opposition to nuclear weapons, our opposition to India, nuclear weaponization, our efforts for a modus vivendi with Pakistan, at least on the question of de-escalating and going towards even a temporary moratorium or ceiling on nuclear weaponization, all these things requires a wider political platform and movement. That's what I'd like to stress. And I know that the CNDP is consistent on this issue, but where we are failing is that we are not bringing it into the political platform and agenda where the issues of the common people can be linked up with this struggle and we can take it forward. But one thing I'm very clear, that in the coming days, this fight against, or this battle in India, the path which is chosen, call it neoliberal, call it India's super capitalist goal of becoming a superpower, and its implications for the people of India. One aspect is democratic rights, civil liberties, but it is also a bread and butter issue of people, livelihood, of the whole question of how we see India going ahead. We have to bring this as part of this struggle against neoliberal capitalism or struggle against thing, and also, though it is not very fashionable to talk about it, anti-imperialism. Because what you see is India and Pakistan, and we saw that very well at the time of 1998, that we allowed the United States of America to move in and become the nuclear umpire, arbitrator between us. And we saw how our foreign policy got completely suborned and changed after we had to strike this deal with the United States of America to get ourselves some legitimacy. So all that flows from that. So I think that we have to take all this into account, and in that process, yes, we must be part of the international movement and struggle for universal nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
About the larger context of anti-nuclear movements and governments. Governments that have nuclear weapons, and even if they don't have nuclear weapons, always want two things. They want to be free to decide what policies they should have and implement them, and they also want that the public should accept what they want to do. In other words, they want the freedom to be able to do what they want, and they also want the question of those policies being legitimized by consent and public this thing here. Anti-nuclear movements, when they are very small, like the CNDP is, really have no chance of changing policies. And so for a long time they operate on the terrain of trying to undermine the other aspect, the legitimacy that governments want, even if they don't have to worry about anti-nuclear movements being able to change policies. However, we have to try and move towards changing the relationship of forces, because never make the mistake of thinking that the better argument is what changes government policy. It's the changes in the relationship of forces that takes place. How do you do this? And there the context, the historical context is different in different parts. The anti-nuclear movements of Japan, Europe and North America were among the greatest mass movements mobilizing millions of people that we have seen in human history. But those movements were basically single issue or two issue movements. Single issue nuclear weapons as a common denominator, or in the case of Europe, nuclear weapons, nuclear energy as being the opposition there. Their strength came from the fact that there was single issue or two issue movements, which could have, since they were developed countries, a very substantial middle class base in which the activists were in fact middle class activists, which would also bring in others. India is a very different situation here. Their weakness was that even though they could mobilize so much, they couldn't really connect to other groups and movements that were involved in issues that were not related to nuclear energy or nuclear weapons. And there were differences between the European movement and the American movement, in the sense that the American movement, being American, would be unlike the campaign for nuclear disarmament in Britain, which saw the necessity of opposing the United States and Britain, not just on the question of nuclear weapons, but on their whole imperialist behavior, the militarism dimension. Whereas if you like, the American movement saying, let's have the lowest common denominator, we can't talk about the terrible characteristics because that'll put people off. Let's just focus on how bad nuclear weapons are or nuclear energy is. In the Indian context, what we found after the CNDP was established was a peculiarity different from the European and the West European. Whereas here, unlike them, we had no problems in a whole range of movements and groups fighting for tribal welfare, for elsewhere, etc., coming and seeing the necessity of this. What we are not able to do is build the kind of mass movement that was existing over there, even though we had a reservoir of appeal, of support for this, which they don't have. But then, of course, the points that Aruna has pointed out about the difficulties, that, etc. here. How do we bring those together? And the key here for us, obviously, this is something that the Second National Convention of the CNDP recognized, and he said, it's not just a question of opposing nuclear weapons, we have to oppose militarism. And the moment you oppose militarism, what happens is that you can make an appeal to all sorts of other groups who see the enormous wastage of that militarism from the point of view of the economic opportunity cost of development, as well as from the moral dimension. So that, of course. And now, because of the question of nuclear energy, I fully support what Aruna said. This is now a mass movement locally. How do you bring them together, the consciousness of? So that is the responsibility that we have upon ourselves. Now, there are two kinds of approaches to trying to change government thinking, and they also relate to individual political personalities. There is what I call the insider route, and there is what I call the outsider route, the connection. What is the insider route? The insider route is that you basically try to persuade the decision makers that what you are doing is mistaken and move towards a more sensible policy, and the way that you try to do it is by an appeal to the question of national interest, and you'll be seen as somebody who will try to be rational, sensible, try to do something sensible from the national interest point of view. The politics of mass mobilization or the outsider route is different. It has to play the politics of exposure and embarrassment of governments. Why? Because one of the most important dimensions of that kind of a movement is that it must bring about the moral support of people. It must make people morally angry about what the governments are doing, their hypocrisies, their deceits, their dishonesties, and all the rest of it. And it's a relationship between the insider and the outsider route that is particularly important in order to shift that, where the outsider aspect is more important to do that. And it's important, particularly important in India, because there's too much getting away from this idea of India being a responsible nuclear power. Those of you in the morning would have heard aspects of that, etc. No matter, they are of course, all nuclear weapon states are irresponsible, but the degree of irresponsibility is of course different. The United States on top, and the others come down here. But let's not, as Indians, avoid the responsibility of outlining and highlighting, and therefore creating that here. I think that's something which is very, very important aspect for us, precisely because we are appealing. And the kind of measures that I want to suggest and so on is also for generating a discourse within civil society, if possible, and that depends upon us taking it elsewhere and so on. Let me start with the changed global context with regard to this question of nuclear weapons. After the end of the Cold War, you don't have the same kind of felt fear on a mass scale that you had earlier, and you don't have the mass movements of the past in Europe, because there's a sense that the danger of global nuclear holocaust has declined. What has happened, however, is that the possibility of a regional or limited nuclear war, geographically limited, has in a sense risen, even if it's not necessarily going to affect Europe, North America, or elsewhere. And you now have four scenarios with regard to the more likely. You can't rule out a global nuclear conflict, etc., but the more likely possibility of certain areas in which these nuclear tensions could arise. And there are four scenarios: Northeast Asia, North Korea, the Middle East, South Asia, and the question of non-state terrorism, which I do not take that seriously. I've written about it in the our piece now, and unless people ask me about it, I won't talk about that here. But let's take these three areas here. North Korea, the biggest culprit for the nuclear tensions there is not North Korea, it's the United States of America. Why? In 1994, the North Koreans agreed to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. After the end of the Cold War, the North Korean leadership recognized that they are going to have to change, and in particular, they're going to have to make fundamental economic changes. Their understanding was that in order for us to be able to do this, the most important source of economic support for us is Japan. I won't go into the miscalculation they made about releasing Japanese business, but they said Japan is key. However, in order for Japan to be able to help us and just make changes, we have to have political normalization with Japan, which is all contingent upon having political normalization with the United States. Otherwise, it's not on. In response to the denuclearization of Korea, the Americans said that we will give you fuel, and yes, we will move towards political normalization. It is the United States of America that reneged on that. And the explosion of the bombs took place, the test took place in North Korea after George Bush's axis of evil comment there. And you had from Clinton onwards trying to withdraw, because that is part of the larger geopolitics in which they would continue to want to put North Korea as a rogue state in order to sustain their alliances with Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and so on, for the containment of China also. The first North Korean response, even after their tests, was that we are going to use this as a bargaining counter now. And we are prepared to give it up in order to have political normalization. Now they seem to have moved to a position, I don't know whether they now feel that they can even use it as a bargaining counter. But the responsibility of the mess lies with the United States of of America rather than North Korea. And of course, you have to move towards political normalization of the United States, because that will change the picture, all the rest. But who's talking about that? The Indian government? Forget it. The Middle East weapons of mass destruction free zone, as is pointed out. All 22 members of the League of Arab States and Iran have for over a decade said, let us have this zone. The biggest obstacle to it is Israel, which is practicing a kind of international filibustering, saying that unless there is a peace settlement with all the Arab nations and with Palestine, and of course by peace settlement they mean that on their terms, we're not going to do anything, etc. here. And it's backed by the United States of America. India, in its own way, this responsible nuclear power, has joined in the little games that have to be played on the IAEA. Who's India to tell Iran or any other country that you shouldn't have nuclear weapons? But we are a responsible nuclear power. And you'll find that being said again and again and again. My point earlier, which is one of the reasons I responded the way is, I do believe, rightly or wrongly, that the politics of exposure and embarrassment is important for the purposes of generating the kind of moral anger, because that moral issue is very, very important. Ordinary people don't like hypocrisy. They don't like deceits. Which is why you have hypocrisy in hypocrisy by the nuclear elite. In 1998, when India had nuclear weapons, they all said, who the hell are the Americans to tell us not to have it? And the public response, because they don't like hypocrisy. Later on, when they have an alliance with the United States, you must understand, international relations is not moral. You have to be hypocritical. So it suits them to go on to to make a highlight the hypocritical question, and it suits them not to do that. It's part of the game of mobilizing and so on. But anyway, here. So the attitude of the Indian government to nuclear weapons free zone was pointed out earlier this morning, saying that the practical value of it is zero, because if there's a nuclear weapon. But the political value is what is very important. And there is a practical value in the sense that unlike the NPT, if you have a nuclear weapons free zone, other countries cannot place nuclear weapons on your territory even if you don't have it. But the most important aspect is the political dimension. And of course it's at the horizontal proliferation level also to reduce. That's a step towards it politically. In fact, the Indian government's attitude to nuclear weapons free zone is as follows. We are a de facto nuclear weapons state. We are prepared to sign the protocols of all nuclear weapons free zones outside, because nuclear weapons free zones have a protocol asking existing nuclear weapon states to respect that. So India would like to be recognized and say we are willing to sign those nuclear protocols here, but don't have it in South Asia. Oh, nuclear weapons free zones, if you heard this morning, are not good, because they're impractical. But the Indian government would like to sign other nuclear weapons free zones because it's part of the process of making itself, de jure if you like, more legitimate in this thing here. Hypocrisy, will you decide for yourself? Does it anger you? Well, not everybody has my sense of anger and irritation, perhaps not. But it's important to point that out. Let's take some of the global measures of nuclear restraint and that we could move towards here. ICAN talks about a ban on the use of nuclear weapons. They have basically given up on the idea of no first use. They're saying go ahead instead for a ban. That's one view here. India and China talk about a no first use. It may or may not surprise you to know that for all the iniquities of China and the much more wonderful character of Indian responsibility as a nuclear weapon state, the Chinese nuclear no first use declaration is superior to that of India. The Indian no first use declaration says we do not rule out using nuclear weapons against countries that don't have nuclear weapons but have other weapons of mass destruction. The Chinese have no such exception. The second is they say we do not rule out use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states that are allied to nuclear weapon states. The Chinese have no such thing. The Chinese ambiguity comes with regard that they imply that they could use nuclear weapons on their own territory. The question of Taiwan. So you have these things, but you have these differences. Who points it out to you in the media? Who points it out from government spokespersons? Is it not necessary for us to generate these things precisely in order to be raised these questions here? The question is the CTBT. My own view now is that if the Americans move towards the CTBT, the Indians and the Pakistani will fall in line. But it really depends upon the Americans ratifying it here. Whether this is going to happen or not, let's wait and see. In the morning you heard about the FMCT, the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. It should better be called a Fissile Material Treaty. There's the question of cutting off production, and there's the question of stockpiles. And you may have heard in the morning about how Pakistan is the problem in the Conference on Disarmament. Things are a little bit more complicated and subtle than this kind of characterization. The anti-nuclear movements worldwide have recognized the Chinese have stopped producing, the Americans and Russians have stopped producing, the French are not producing, the British are not producing weapons, fissile material. In fact, as the Russians and the Americans move towards reducing their nuclear stockpiles, their nuclear weapons, missile warheads and so on, they will be adding to their stockpiles. The Chinese have enough stockpiles. The Indians and Pakistanis don't. What in my view is the Indian calculation? Let's keep a low profile on this question of the FMT discussions and negotiations that are taking place. Let Pakistan get the blame because it's creating problems, because it's focusing on the question of stockpiles. Here, we'll keep a low profile, even if these negotiations take place 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years will take place, and we will have built a stockpile. And after the Indo-US nuclear deal, the Indian capacity to add to its weapons stockpile is much greater than the Pakistanis, and the Pakistanis understand this. So the Pakistanis are emphatic on the question of what about stockpiles. If you don't have stockpiles and you have an FMCT, it has absolutely no effect on the Americans, the Russians and the others, and even India. What is the attitude of the peace movements to this issue? The attitude of the peace movements is that what do we do? Do we make the best the enemy of the good, which is to say that stockpiles should also come in, or should we satisfy ourselves with a fissile material cut-off treaty? The broad consensus view here is that we will have to compromise, but not like the Indians and the Americans and the Russians and the French and the British want us. Yeah. We won't go as far as insisting that you must have a system of actually reducing stockpiles, but let us insist that there actually be some form of international monitoring and storage of the stockpiles that these countries have here as a movement towards particular that. Now that's something to think about. Ask yourself, why is it that the discourse in the Indian media does not talk about it? Why is it that the Indian spokespersons who go on and on about how responsible India is will never talk about such things? Pakistan is the problem, which is not to say that Pakistan is not the problem, but I think it's important to understand that here. With regard to the NMD, the nuclear missile defense, ballistic missile defense, India recognized until 2002 that this is something which is a disaster. After the Americans under Bush abrogated the anti-ballistic missile defense, the Indians have kept quiet because of the relationship with the strategic alliance, and they're saying, what about subcontracting, what about a theater missile defense and all that. This is a disaster. Basically, it's geared, forget about what the Americans are saying, that this is for Iran and North Korea. Everybody knows, including the Russians and Chinese, is directed towards them. And what the Russians and the Chinese are going to do is they're going to try to overload that system, which is a defense shield, by producing more and bigger and having more and more warheads on one missile, which is then going to push the Indians to say, well, the Chinese have more and more, we have to have more and more, which is going to have a knock-on effect on the Pakistanis. In other words, you now have not just a nuclear arms race between India and Pakistan, but it is one which is not even in their control, the two countries, because what happens elsewhere will also have this effect. I asked this question, it was here in the morning. You would have noticed that Mr. Rakesh Sood, the envoy, just avoided or said, this is something between two. You can condemn it. In fact, if it's just between the two, why did the Indian government earlier approve it? It has no business coming. Of course not. It's a dodge. But there it is. Let's come to some regional measures, which I think are very, very important, because we have the responsibility of putting these forward to generate a discourse within civil society, even as we're not going to be able to influence the government on the basis of a reasoned, a rational application and so on. But let me suggest certain things here which I think are very important, because we do have the responsibility of taking steps at the regional level towards here. I've already mentioned about the Middle East and North Korea, Northeast Asia. Until a CTBT comes into place, and since neither India nor Pakistan are thinking of having any nuclear tests, and they won't, they lose nothing if they were to agree to a bilateral test ban and then sign on to the CTBT. That would be one possibility. A second, which I think indirectly relates, what about a nuclear disengagement zone on both sides of the border? Again, practical effect is not important. It's a political step. For a certain period, Pakistan is smaller territory, but you say for 50 kilometers or whatever, neither India nor Pakistan is going to have nuclear missiles, and then if you categorically legally say that they're not going to have weapons, nuclear missiles there, or they'll even have not just a nuclear disengagement zone, but even a demilitarized zone, etc. It's a confidence building measure which could be there. The problem with all confidence building measures, and this is I think where Prakash's point comes in, is that it's not so much that confidence building measures create trust. It's more the other way around. It's the predisposition to trust that makes confidence building measures more effective, which is why it is after the end of the Cold War that the confidence building measures between Russia and the United States were much more effective than before. But nonetheless, let's raise these, let's put it out in the public agenda, let's see. They might not lose anything, they could do that. Another proposal is that the Indian government and the Pakistani government get annoyed by the fact that many people from outside, including other nuclear weapon states, keep on pointing to Kashmir as a nuclear flashpoint. And the response, which K. Subramaniam was very fond of saying and others, is that do you think that nuclear weapons in the hands of brown people means that we are more irresponsible than white people or whatever, which has an impact. Oh, I should just see here, right? So if you don't like it, then what about a nuclear weapons free zone on both parts in Kashmir, on both sides of the border? Its practical effect, zero. The Indians don't and the Pakistanis don't have nuclear weapons there. Its political effect, isn't this a response to those who would say Kashmir could be a flashpoint? Huh? Whether they will do it or not, very unlikely, but that is for other reasons. But we can raise this point here. Yeah, and this thing here. So that is incidentally one party, political party in Pakistan, the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir has in fact raised this. Two political parties you've said here, and this is. Sorry, 2 minutes. Okay, sorry. Okay, yeah. I'll be finishing here very soon here. Again, this is something that our political parties here could also think about here. Lastly, with regard to the question of how we can move towards steps, and we have a responsibility to try to do it here, not just at the international level. I believe that India-Pakistan going nuclear has created a lot of anger, and perhaps greater anger, among the populations of our neighbors. Because if there is a conflict between India and Pakistan, and this is where Jean's point comes in, when he talked about an escalation dynamic. An escalation dynamic means precisely that two people at this two countries, to begin with, have absolutely no wish to start a nuclear war, India and Pakistan here. But if you get caught in a conflict, then there creates a escalation dynamic where two sides, which began by saying that they will never use nuclear weapons, have to start thinking, maybe the other side is using it, we have to do it, we have to make it. And in 1999, you know that both sides made preparations. That's the problem over here. I would suggest, and we have suggested this here, is that it's important for the governments and populations of our neighboring countries, in particular Bangladesh and Nepal, to try and embarrass and make things politically uncomfortable for India and Pakistan. And one of the things that in fact can be done, which I've suggested to a number of people here, and incidentally the Foreign Secretary of Bangladesh is the only official person who has actually come out in the past to say that we want a South Asian nuclear weapons free zone. So you have a certain measure there here. And that is to talk about stretching the Bangkok Treaty, which is the nuclear weapons free zone for Southeast Asia, to include Bangladesh. The Indians can't do anything about it, the Pakistan can't do anything about it, but it can be a certain kind of a political slap in the face. And this is it over here. They can think about it. Even more interesting, Nepal. Mongolia is the only country which is a single state nuclear weapons free zone, which is different from being nuclear free like Austria. Because if you're a single state nuclear weapons free zone, you ask for protocols from other nuclear weapon states to recognize it. However, Nepal has the opportunity to become the first country in the world, and therefore there's a unique aspect to it which is appealing to Nepalese, that in their constitution they become the first single state nuclear weapons free zone. I've written about it, I've talked to a number of people in the different political parties, and this response that they got was that this is an interesting idea, because they're worried about India's big brothership and all the rest of it. Liked it here. Even the youth wing of the Nepali Congress said, good, well, it'll put Nepal on the international stature, we're distinctive and unique, and it sends a message, and then you can talk about other things over here. And then of course they say, but you've got the Indian government, which is a responsible nuclear state, which is going to put pressure on the Nepali Congress, and they don't like it. Well, can we not reach out to civil society in Nepal and seek to push that perspective there and to begin into debate? And because if they have the courage and we are able to move towards having that in their constitution, that too constitutes a measure for it. My point being, of course, is that we have to think creatively in various ways to move towards, and we have to think, and you will have to decide from yourself, do you want to be involved in the politics of exposure and embarrassment? Do you want to be in the insider politics, or do you feel that you can bridge the two? And different political personalities are best at each of these different things, and we have to find ways, if you like, of connecting that. But the most important thing is how do we move towards building a mass movement here. And here I think, Aruna, your suggestions and all is something that is very, very, very important, and we'll have to move towards in that direction. Thank you very much.
I don't believe in a carolus chair, so I'm not going to sum up anything, but I just want to make one small point before opening it for discussion, arising from something that Aruna ji said about how we appear small, the space is big, and it's also largely to do because the media is shutting us out. And I think peace, I just want to make the point that when Achin talked of the ruling class and the ruling elite, the media today is, and has been for a few years now, become part of the ruling elite. So we are no longer the watchdog. And when you become part of the ruling elite, you accept the manifestations and the symbols of a macho state, the militarization, of nuclearization, and where you discard peace as an agenda, which we have, and where war and warmongering has become very much part of the media ethos. There are no questions asked, which is another major issue. So you don't get the strength, and you don't get the support, and you don't get the kind of, I don't like to use the word publicity, but at least a space to say what the alternative voice is saying all over the country. I think a case in point is this Aman Ki Asha, which was signed in by two warmongering newspapers, one which calls itself the Jung and came in for Jung, and the other Times of India, which you can see every night on its television channel. And for them, it is not peace. It is, excuse the word, but the bastardization of peace, because it comes in with the corporates, it comes in through advertisements, through mega events, through getting big money in the name of peace without contributing at all to what really makes peace an ideology. So I just wanted to add that, and let's open it to everyone for questions, comments.
A ban treaty as opposed to a convention which is a comprehensive convention that abolishes nuclear weapons storage, production, use, etc., etc. A ban treaty is simply a declaratory treaty wherein members of the treaty agree that they prohibit the presence of nuclear weapons on their territory or the use of weapons on their territory and call it illegal. They want the idea that nuclear weapons get the stigma of being illegal or being declared illegal somewhere in the world. So with that in mind, ICAN went ahead and actually, since 2012, went ahead and led this movement that culminated in a conference in Oslo in March this year. I attended that conference as well, wherein 117 states there, I think it was, or 120 odd, who turned up to say that they agree that the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons is unacceptable. That became the basis to then spearhead a movement towards a ban treaty, saying that if you all agree that the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons is unacceptable, then please say that you think that nuclear weapons are illegal on your territory. So then came the idea that, the interesting idea that since the nuclear disarmament debate is on to the slowest train possible, with nuclear weapon states leading the nuclear disarmament movement, why not take the initiative away from them towards the non-nuclear weapon states? To imagine all these years that the non-nuclear weapon states have merely been observers to this drama being played out by nuclear weapon states, why not bring that to an end? Put the initiative in the lap of the non-nuclear weapon states to say, we agree that the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons is unacceptable, and start moving forward. The idea was you start with the non-nuclear states, then you slowly work your way in to the nuclear fold by working into the nuclear weapons allies. Now, Norway, as you know, is a member of NATO, enjoys the nuclear umbrella, but nevertheless organized this conference. The P5 did not turn up there. Now, this debate has moved to the UN First Committee. And as you know, there was also, with the Secretary General of the United Nations, an open-ended working group that was set up on nuclear disarmament. This open-ended working group led to a high-level meeting. On the 26th of September this year, when our foreign minister went to this high-level meeting, unfortunately, he declared towards the end of his speech, which he thought was a great speech, he said, and the noble goal of nuclear disarmament. Ironic that, 25 years ago, you had a prime minister laying out an action plan, and 25 years later, you had a foreign minister declaring it clearly as a noble goal, making it absolutely clear that India is totally not interested in pursuing this in any real fashion. Criticism mounted. The pressure on the member states, both the P5 as well as the non-nuclear weapon states, mounted so much at the UN that 125 states, Professor Mohanty, you were referring to this, the number is actually 125 states, much more than the 115 who are a part of the nuclear weapon-free zones around the world, signed on to a statement led by New Zealand, which said that we accept that the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons is unacceptable. And building on that, we must therefore believe that the only way forward is the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, the idea is they've called for a conference in Mexico next year in February. And Tilman Ruff, who was on here in the morning by Skype, has mentioned that their effort is that by Mexico, they would have a list of states who would be ready to commit themselves to a timeline wherein they are ready to negotiate a ban treaty. And only a ban treaty, by the way, not more. Now, I find this idea of a ban treaty very intriguing. I think, first of all, it's a very creative idea. It cuts through the chaff of much of the points that have been made by panelists here. I think, for example, struggling with, should we politically embarrass governments? How should we raise mass consciousness in moments like this? It cuts to the chase to say that, look, a nuclear explosion is completely unacceptable. Any ordinary person can understand that. And here's what we did in the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan report that I was a part of. There was a particular chapter devoted only to what might happen if there's a nuclear exchange, either through terrorists or through states or whatever. And we criticized the NDMA as well, because at that point there was no NDMA. We said the government of India has gone ahead, had a credible minimum deterrent policy, no nuclear weapons, created nuclear weapons, but no policy on civil defense for people. Meaning you're saying to your people, we have the right to produce nuclear weapons to protect our country, but hey, we are doing nothing about protecting our people in case there is actually a need to use them. So this put pressure on the government. It led to the NDMA. I'm not saying the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan report directly led to it, but certainly there was pressure put on the government. And I know that the NDMA's thinking on the subject is as follows. They say if there is a nuclear explosion, there's nothing we can do about it. So their strategy actually is to look at centers that are outside of the explosion zone and see how they can get help in those zones to safeguard people there. In other words, it works in actually with the humanitarian approach that the ICAN is trying to spearhead. With all the pressure that we brought to bear on the government of India now, there was one change made by our now permanent representative to the United Nations, Venkatesh Verma, earlier Joint Secretary of the DISA. On 18th of October, he merely said that we support the NAM statement. 18th of October was the date when New Zealand was going to introduce its statement of 125 states. India didn't sign it. A competing draft came up from Australia, but it didn't have as much support as the New Zealand draft. Now, the key point is here, is just this. The New Zealand draft, the original that ICAN had done, called for a legal prohibition. Japan wanted to sign on to it and said, please keep this language of the legal prohibition out. So long as you stick to just the humanitarian impact, we are ready to sign on to it. In the interest of garnering more support, they dropped the legal language and kept the humanitarian impact language in, but said, under any circumstances, the use of nuclear weapons would be unacceptable under any circumstances, and Japan, which is a nuclear umbrella state, signed on to that statement. Australia didn't want to sign on and produced its own statement, which didn't have as much support. But clearly, in the United Nations today, in the First Committee today, and the thematic debate that followed the high-level meeting, the world community at large is completely conscious and aware of the growing importance of this humanitarian approach. I think it's a very simple approach, it's a very good approach. The only problem with that approach that I see is that it suggests that it must uphold the global norms of non-proliferation. In other words, it works in the NPT language into it, which is a problem that India has. So we pressured the Indian government to say that, look, don't reject this out of hand, because you yourself are saying that you uphold the non-proliferation regime in this world, and after all, the non-proliferation regime has been created by the NPT. So finally, on the 21st of October, the same ambassador of India goes on the floor to say that we should encourage the humanitarian approach, but make it inclusive, make sure that the P5 don't boycott, in other words, let everyone attend it. But we want to ask the question that how come some of those who are nuclear umbrella states, nuclear allied states, and those who used to be in partnership, indicating New Zealand, did not sign a resolution that India moved way back in 1982 on the non-use of nuclear weapons. So, I'm sorry, I'll just finish off very quickly. So, having said that, India's only problem seemed to be that if New Zealand could refuse the initiative we took 30 years ago, why should we accept New Zealand's approach now? However, we won't stand in the way of this process going forward. So I think for the peace movement in India, the important lesson, the takeaway, I believe, is to start focusing on the humanitarian aspect of the impact of nuclear weapons, because people can understand that more simply, more directly. And I would simply say this: let's not look at the political value of nuclear weapon-free zones, because that's as flawed an argument, I'm sorry, Achin, as the argument that nuclear weapons have political value. It's exactly the counterface of the same argument. So I don't think we should go down that path. As you say rightly yourself, the hypocrisy needs to be pointed out, because the moral argument is the main argument, and the moral argument is really the practical argument at the end of the day. Thank you.
Take up various aspects of nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race that is in progress now, and tie them up with people's agendas. And I think one way of doing it is to highlight just how much wasteful expenditure nuclear weapons have involved in the past 15 years since India crossed the threshold. Our military spending has risen by more than 3.5 times. We are now at the beginning of building the nuclear triad with a nuclear submarine, which is going to cost something like $5 to $7 billion. We are acquiring aircraft carriers and so on and so forth, which will fly nuclear-capable aircraft. Various things like that, and this is only for starters. This is, in fact, as you get into this business of building a not so minimal credible deterrent, and the size is not known, it's very, very ambitious, you're going to spend more and more money. And you can demonstrate that just about everything else has risen much slower than military expenditure, and this is a straight guns versus butter issue. The second question is that of the of space and this whole Mars expedition, the moon expedition, and so on. Let us call a spade a spade. The space program is a cousin of the missile program. Well, we are sending now increasingly military satellites into space that are absolutely crucial for military communications, for espionage, for various purposes like that. And this needs to be said, this needs to be pointed out. Second, and very important, the space vehicle launchers actually become missiles. The Agni is nothing but the SLV-3 on top of which stands a Prithvi. Every single missile that is being developed by India as a nuclear weapons capable missile is based on the SLV platform or modified platform of the same satellite launch vehicle, right? Another very interesting and important angle is that India is under pressure to get into a competition with China in the technology to develop a technology to shoot down satellites. The United States has and Russia established this technology. China did so 2 years ago, and now we are being pressed to do the same thing. Of course, this goes against the stated goal of militarization of space that India professes to stand by. I think issues like this have to be brought into the picture. I don't know if any of the left parties, Prakash, have made a statement on the Mars mission, but if they do, and it is a totally wasteful mission with no scientific value whatsoever, it's not going to add to any understanding of either Mars or of space technology or of whatever, of any science, right? At the same time, our basic sciences are eroding. India, which was the unquestioned science superpower of the third world till 10, 15 years ago, is now lagging behind not just China, but Singapore and Brazil and several other states like that, right? And this is actually a huge amount of neglect of the basic sciences at the expense of these programs. Don't forget that between the Department of Atomic Energy, the Department of Space, and the Defense Research and Development Organization, they eat up something like 70% of the central government science and technology budget. This should be unacceptable. Any expansion of these programs, is at the expense of good science. One question, specifically to Prakash, but also to others, which is this, that, you oppose the US-India nuclear deal, and I think, of course, quite rightly. But as you went into a criticism of the deal, there were two components. One was that this would actually mean that India gives up on its nuclear disarmament agenda to fight for a nuclear weapons world, because the idea is to secure that deal is to get recognition for India's nuclear weapons. Second, it would promote a possibly inappropriate technology, and thirdly, it would get into a strategic, a partnership with the United States, which is undesirable. But as the debate progressed, the first part of diversion of attention away from fighting for a nuclear weapons-free world got diluted. You also, I think, for instance, joined scientists who were hawkish in opposing the nuclear deal. Some of the scientists wanted yet more tests of the hydrogen bomb because they said they had not been perfected. Now, you think this can still be corrected, and so that we can return to an emphasis on the agenda of nuclear disarmament and rebuild it into the critique of all the agreements that were grandfathered, so to speak, and are going to be grandfathered by the US-India nuclear deal.
One more question, and then it's a comment.
Archon, you started your presentation with pointing out that how nuclear disarmament has to be linked to militarism. Because in that context, in the morning itself, I had repeatedly raised this issue of why the McLaughlin Accord has gone out of the purview of the peace movement. Why it has been completely sidelined when it was a comprehensive program for general and complete disarmament. See? That has to be addressed, And the issues, now it appears that the onus of nuclear disarmament is on the non-nuclear weapon states. I mean, I find this argument very strange. See, why should nuclear weapon-free zones or CTBT or FMCT? See, what is CTBT? It doesn't even define what constitutes nuclear weapon test explosion. Then what are you actually signing? It just you're after issues which are totally immaterial, And FMCT, I totally agree with the Pakistan position. Unless the stockpile issue is taken up, it's totally meaningless. But why should these are all side issues? The first issue is no first use, and non-use against non-nuclear weapon states. See? Without these issues and de-alert, alerting, these are the crucial issues. What you have proposed are all side issues, which places the onus on non-nuclear weapon states. Is it?
Prakash, you want to answer?
Well, what Praful has asked about in the opposition to this Indo-US nuclear deal, the first part of it about nuclear disarmament was left behind or dropped out in the course of the battle. Yes, it's true that a section of nuclear scientists oppose the agreement from the point of view, as you pointed out, that this will restrict our capabilities and further testing, etc. That's a fact. But at that time, it was a united front of all those who could come together to oppose. We could not really make a distinction. And don't forget, subsequently, our focus, and we succeeded to a limited extent, was on the liability law. So we had to fight on that, and we succeeded in keeping that Section 7 and preventing the dilution of that, though they tried it actually. But it's true that in the course of that, we highlighted more the strategic alliance and foreign policy and other implications of it domestically of the nuclear deal. And as far as the nuclear disarmament part of it, yes, that did not come to the fore at that time, but you're right, we should be able to bring that back into the focus.
I see them as not just, they're not hypocritical, I see them as even moral statements, especially by countries that have the capacity but decide not to do that and to join nuclear weapons-free zones. And if anybody asks themselves, would it not be desirable and a great contribution towards lasting peace of a non-nuclear kind if the Middle East had a nuclear weapons-free zone? I think the answer is very obvious about that, and this whole question of Iran and hypotheses and so on, etc. So my view on that is that they are very, very important. Think of the impact politically if Bangladesh were to accept the Bangkok Treaty and Nepal did that. It would be a political slap in the face and have political value on India and Pakistan. That's my view there. On the question of militarism, the point that you raised, yes, you are insisting on the, according to that there must be a connection between the two. Actually, the NPT does say words about general decline in militarism also. My own approach is a little bit different in the sense that I emphasize the centrality of that towards building a much larger mass movement in India. Because the moment you bring in militarism, you connect to the two important dimensions, the economic wastefulness of that when you have such developmental problems, and the moral dimension, which is very, very important. So I do stress that, and that's what the CNDP has said that. In the case of internationally, I think it has to be connected to the United States. Here the issue is something like this. Nuclear weapons are the most extreme form of military power. But because of the great disjunction between political power and military power, the United States, which has such incredible military might, loses politically. And if it loses politically in spite of that, then more people start asking themselves, what is the relevance of nuclear weapons and all the rest of it with regard? That's why I insist that there should be a connection, like Prakash has also said, against anti-imperialism and that here. Your point about everywhere internationally extending it, I don't insist on that because that brings in the here. But as a general propaganda perspective, just that, fine. But I also believe that there are just wars. But in the Indian context and Pakistan context, reduce the budget, certainly. Here there are two approaches that you can take. You can have a military strength which is a power projection. Or you can decide that we should have enough military strength to protect our borders. It is not axiomatic that big countries have to power project. You find differences. India, China want to power project. Brazil doesn't want to power project. A middle country like Britain, 60 million policy, for historical reasons, wants to power project. Vietnam, 80 million, needs no lessons from anybody for independence, incidentally has joined the Bangkok Treaty despite a 1,000-year history of a conflict with China, which India does not have, and has the capacity to make nuclear weapons if it wants and needs no lessons, doesn't want to power project. A small country like Sweden does not want to power project. Israel wants to power project. These are choices that we can make with regard to that, which raise a larger question of national security. So that military was there. And lastly, on the question of negative security assurances, and this connects to what Vidya said and what you have said, I have no problems. ICAN says, forget about no first use. Just go ahead with ban, right? My own position is, I see the value of that. I support pressing that. But I also have a view that, look, if you're pressing for no first use, go ahead with that. In other words, we can try and explore many, many, many different directions here, and we should do that. That's my own view on that.
So that's it?
May I add a sentence on this humanitarian focus? So that's also the formulation of this conference. I think there are ways of interpreting humanitarian approach. We shouldn't pit it against politics. I think if we do that, then it would be difficult to link up. I remember the Baliapal struggle, 82-84. The missile test range location in Baliapal, there was a people's movement, and the issue was precisely, the poverty, development issues, destruction of people's resources, and so on. But what happened? They just moved the test range to an island, the movement was gone. And I think it's very important to maintain the political perspective of the humanitarian issues involved in the anti-nuclear movement and link it up with people's commonplace issues. Thank you.
Well, we thank all the panelists.
Communication and reaching out to more people. We need some powerful one-liners that just get repeated and repeated and repeated. I mean, 5 years ago, nobody knew that the poverty line, nobody knew what the poverty line is. Now everyone, even in villages, everyone knows that 32 rupees kya hai. I mean, it's like household issue. And basically because, the government made a stupid statement in the Supreme Court and it was taken out and made a press release and it was repeated forever. And so now it's like common knowledge. 10 years ago, nobody knew that half of Indian children are undernourished. Now it's been repeated so many times that, again, everyone knows and anybody realizes that this is not acceptable. So there are things like that also in this domain. I mean, India is the biggest arms exporter in the world, importer in the world. How many people know that? And how many people would find that acceptable? We need things that people will actually, common people will immediately react to that and say, what is this? Military expenditure twice as high as health expenditure. Who will agree with that? But how many people know that? Scientific research, you pointed out quite rightly, 70% is military research. Again, so we need some facts and one-liners like that, and then put them out and repeat them, and that will help to reach to a larger audience, I think.
Can easily be done to bring the focus back on nuclear disarmament is to constantly test the government on its statements. It avers that India is a reluctant nuclear weapons power. It avers, even today Rakesh was saying it, he said that we continue to believe that the safety and security of India is more valuable than the diversity of nuclear weapons. Well then what are you doing about it? It's a question that you must raise in Parliament. And in fact, if you check the record of disarmament activities by the Indian government, ever since the last the Chemical Weapons Convention, we haven't supported any disarmament initiative at all. In fact, we have been great fence sitters. We sat on the fence in the Landmines Treaty. I mean, you name it, cluster munitions, the Arms Trade Treaty. We sat on the fence again. We actually voted against we didn't support the open-end working group that the United Nations Secretary General set up now. Not even support. I mean, we sat on the fence for that too, and yet we participated in all this. We sat on the fence, we refused to sign the CNDP, we are willing to do it if the US signs it. We sat on the fence, but we say, but we have a voluntary moratorium. We are not members of the NPT, we refuse to sign the NPT, but we say we maintain the non-proliferation regime. I mean, I ask the question, what alternative is India offering the world? You want to be a P6. In Oslo, the Indian government ambassador felt really, buffed up because the foreign minister of Norway referred to India as the P6. So, I mean, what do you want? You want to be a P6, but you don't have an alternative vision for the world. You just want to sit on the fence. Each time you want to tell the world, no, you're not right. No, you're not right. We don't agree with you. And the other thing you do is you pick up the rule book and throw them at them. And you say, no, the rules don't allow you to discuss like this. So what is our alternative? So if we keep testing the government on its averment, you believe that you sincerely want to follow nuclear, well, what are you doing about it? What's your plan of action? Then I think they will have to sit up and keep making these mistakes again from their point of view. I mean, they actually don't want to support nuclear disarmament. They just want to build up their nuclear missiles and MIRV warheads and build up ICBMs that will knock off Washington DC and New York. But hey, if we keep raising these questions, then I think when public statements will come and we can perhaps have a way of moving forward. Thank you.
Just one minute. I raised the issue of the government of India holding a nuclear weapons convention. Just a correction, because in 1947, India, at the initiative of the government of India, the Indian Council of World Affairs held an Asian Relations Conference. And in 1948, the Conference on Indonesia. A similar, at a non-governmental level, a similar initiative can be taken with the support of the government of India to hold a nuclear weapons convention. And nothing prevents the government from doing that. And I think the left party should demand.
Persuade the government.
Yeah, you should persuade the government to.
Okay. Just one small statement.
You don't have anything like peace studies anywhere in this country prominently there. Not being introduced, no, but still, it is not there. Actually, it's not there in the common understanding of what you could do. So, peace studies. I remember when I was in high school, there was a big competition held, and the topic of that competition was peace is possible. Now you don't say that anymore. So I think if you bring the concept of peace and peace studies, then you counter this in a positive way, and you bring in a debate on how essential it is to have peace for so many other things. So I think while we do this, I think because I know it's there in big universities, but in official times nobody knows anything about peace.
Even not in big universities.
Children taught about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and what happened. I mean, it's shocking. This is probably the only country in the world where textbooks do not mention school.
It's not mentioned in Japan also, don't worry.
Just one single line definition of the central argument for having nuclear weapons, a single line definition of deterrence. Deterrence is the irrational belief that terrible fear will always ensure that your opponent will always behave in the way you want that opponent to behave, although he is operating in circumstances that you can never fully control. That is really the fundamental nature of deterrence. And T, if you could announce that T is available.
Thanks to him. Yeah. Okay, that's the last point because I think everybody, half the panelists will leave.
India has already acquired capability for destroying satellites. That capability is the DRDO has officially announced that last year.
We'll remind you.